everybody, how are you? I'm coming to you in a slightly different mode today because we're not having an adventure in Australian literature. Today I am here as part of Shakespeare Month to celebrate our new release. This book, which I'll put up behind me because the green on the cover plays hell with the green screen. But this book, Shaking Up Shakespeare, which is our latest book. It is a book for teachers. It is the book I wanted when I started teaching, and now that I have over 2 decades worth of teaching behind me, I felt, okay, I can write this book for people now. It's 4 full units of work, an introduction to Shakespeare unit plus 3 plays, a comedy, a history, and a tragedy. And you can pre-order this now in time for its July 1st release at the Black Cockie Press website, or indeed it's up on Amazon and other online retailers if you're outside of Australia. But there we go. That's why we're doing Shakespeare this month. And that's why I'm coming to you not with Australian literature, but in a guise that was actually my original guise when I started on the channel, which was historical research. And Shaking Up Shakespeare required a ton of research. What I thought would be a very quick book to write turned out to be an absolute monster, because there is a whole lot of stuff you think you know about Shakespeare. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of it is hearsay. A lot of it has no decent historical source. A lot of it, this was what I thought. I thought this is going to be easy. I can just pull something together quite quickly. And when I looked at things, I'd go and ask, well, what is your historical source for that? Because half of my degree, my undergraduate degree, is in history. In fact, that's my major. So I approached, especially the introductory part, as a historian, not as an English teacher, because we're looking at a person in history. And I would look at things and say, well, what's your source for that? And when I found, looking back, oh, it's something from the late 19th century, how does that tell us anything about what was actually happening in 16th century theatre practice? It doesn't. You're making it up, because there's a lot of really old history where they really did make it up. They just made stuff up because it was tradition was telling them that. Alternately, it dates back to the 18th century. Finding primary sources for Shakespeare's time can be hard. Why? Because they had a whopping great civil war in the middle of it, between then and now. The interregnum, the civil war and interregnum is in the same century that Shakespeare was living, in the 17th century. He was living at the very early, it's smack bang in the middle, the Restoration is in the end. Okay, the tensions and political things that were leading up to the Civil War and the interregnum were already at play in Shakespeare's world. So that people aren't hanging on to bits of paper during a civil war, especially with a political system that is so incredibly hostile to theatres, considering that the Globe Theatre was pulled down and the site used for housing by the Puritan government. Okay, they were incredibly hostile to theatre. So they weren't keeping records. They didn't care about the records. So that has an impact on what happened. And then by the 18th century, you start getting people interested in Shakespeare, but they're finding it very, very difficult to find the records because of, that aforesaid civil war that was very hostile. And England's a cold, wet place. Paper, not so great in a cold, wet place. Ancient Egypt, yeah, we'll find papyrus from the ancients. Desert, nice and dry, good for preserving paper. Cold, damp places, not so great. So between the climate and the political situation, finding those primary documents is a hard thing. And the 18th century gave us a very different concept of the author, a very different concept of the author than Shakespeare would have recognised, especially as the 18th century saw the development of what we would see as modern copyright law, and therefore the author becomes a very primate, like the primacy of the author becomes really, really important, and the way that they're seen becomes really important. And so that influenced how people read Shakespeare, how people understood him. And then, of course, the long time deification of Shakespeare that has progressed to a point that he becomes detached entirely from his context meant we have a popular concept of Shakespeare that bears very little resemblance to the historical figure that we have evidence for. And this, I think, leads to one of the big controversies is, did Shakespeare write Shakespeare? And I have a book about that. But and the answer is yes, he did. Yes, he did. But it meant that the research for this book took a lot longer than I thought. I had no idea it was going to be such a research-heavy book. But there you go. And so we're going to have a look at some of the books that or actually all of the books that I used to research this, because I spent a good 6 months just doing research to write this book. So first of all, I used, and there's a whole load of these, so I'm not going to go through them individually because they all work as a thing, as a job lot, because they're a series. These, I've got 6 of them. These are the Cambridge Companion series. So I've got one to Shakespeare, the history plays, the tragedies, the comedies, Shakespeare and language. So look at the language they use. And this one, which is really interesting, Shakespeare and contemporary dramatists. So putting him into context, really important. Putting the plays into context, because they read differently in context to just in isolation. But these are a great series of books. They're not the cheapest of things. They're about $50 Australian each, so they're academic textbooks. All of these works are, on the whole, academic textbooks. Some are more accessible than others, but it makes them really expensive academic textbooks. But these are all written, the Cambridge Companion series, they're all written by academics. They're a whole series of essays. So what you get is a good selection across of different aspects of the plays from a variety of different academics. They are academic texts, so what's the difference between an academic text and the text for a general readership? Academic texts are relying on the fact that you have a university degree to be able to read them. It's one of those things that can make these books inaccessible. They are spendy, and they also are written in a way that a degree trains you to read. Like, when you do a degree, you learn to read this sort of stuff, learn how to read this, whereas just picking them up and perusing them, yes, you can, but you generally do get more out of an academic text than with the degree than without the degree. And I know this because I've seen, when I bought a lot of these books, I saw a lot of comments on Amazon saying, you know, this is too hard to read, this is too difficult, because they're not made for a general audience, they're made for an academic audience, they're research heavy books. So another book that we had a look at was Shakespeare After All by Marjorie Garber. This one discusses all the plays. Every single one of the plays is in here. little essay on each of them. So that's an interesting one. Looking at, I want to do you next. Looking at theatre. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do was take the concept of Shakespeare out of lone genius and put him into a context. And his context is the theatre world of Elizabethan and early Jacobin London. Now, this is a really complex, interesting theatre world. It is a very dynamic world. It is a very changeable world. It is a world where fortunes can be made, but it's also an incredibly dangerous world. Playwrights died. Playwrights killed each other. Playwrights were arrested. Playwrights were tortured. Marlowe is probably the most famous example of this, of a playwright who was killed. Why he was killed in Deptford could have more to do with his activities as a spy for the government than as a playwright, but he also was quite a controversial figure. I think it was Peel was arrested with him and was tortured. Nash and Benjamin Jonson were also arrested. I believe that was the Isle of Dogs incident. They were both, Nash was tortured and died not long after, so that didn't do well. Ben Jonson managed to get himself into a lot of trouble. He killed another playwright in a duel, and narrowly escaped the death penalty. But he still went on to be a great writer of masques for King James, and he was a significant frenemy of Shakespeare. They never collaborated, but Ben Jonson wrote a poem to Shakespeare to go into the first folio. So, and Shakespeare performed, and the Globe performed some of Ben Jonson's plays. So this is a theatre world where people know each other, rivalries exist, and it's very dynamic and interesting. And what's more interesting is, how did Shakespeare and the Globe, because Shakespeare is not by himself, he's attached to a theatre company, he's a sharer in a theatre company, how did they manage to negotiate this very, very difficult world? And that is a really fascinating thing, and that's what we have with some of our next few books, which are all on the theatre. So we have Actors and Acting in Shakespeare's Time. This is by John H. Astington. We have Tiffany Stearns, Making Shakespeare from Stage to Page. And we have Shakespeare in Parts, and this one is by Simon Palfrey and Tiffany Stern. So these are about Elizabethan theatre, and again, these are books that, when I looked at their reviews on Amazon, found a lot of people complaining, I wanted a book about gossip in the gossip of Shakespeare's theatre. It's like, honey, you're not going to find that. Did I mention Internegram? Did I mention that, you know, the climate in England, not good? You're not going to find that. Also, people didn't necessarily write those things down. They just didn't. But these are really, really good books if you want to look at the nature of theatre in Elizabethan England. These ones, and I think this one, is also Commercial and Political Influences in Elizabethan Theatre, Art Imitates Business, by James H. Force. This is the oldest book that I used. All of these books, except for this one, are all published in the 21st century. This is about 30 years old. These are at most 20 years old. This one and these do cast a certain amount of doubt on the question of, did they have children in the adult theatres? They did have child theatres. They were indoors, and they were really, really it could be quite scandalous. Ben Jonson got in trouble for his Eastward Ho, which was with the Children's Theatre, and mocked the Scots, and James I was like, are you kidding me? Dude. You know, but it does, from these books, it becomes more apparent that the adult theatres saw children as rivals, and the more that you understand about the actual theatre world, the amount of money that these things cost, things like costumes cost a fortune, and boys they change shape quickly, and they're often moving between jobs. There were children in the theatres. They were contracted in, but there was no such thing as an apprenticeship. People had to have an apprenticeship before they became an actor so that they weren't a vagrant. Technically, being an actor was a vagrant. So actors had to have an apprenticeship, which rather suggests that the actors playing the women were grown men. Young men, but grown men. And that is a claim that this book makes. There is also contextual evidence from Carolyn Theatre of someone, one of them is a theatre production where we're really sorry the Queen is shaving. A lot of things that are suggesting, because much like the Egyptians didn't bother to tell us how to write the pyramids, make the pyramids, because, well, it's obvious, isn't it? People often don't write down things that don't seem like, well, duh. It's obvious. You don't need to write these things down. So we're now having to look for hints rather than to prove these things. But the actual evidence that people keep going to, that children played the adult women roles, especially now that we have the reconstructed globe, and you can see how much vocal force it takes to fill that space. Children don't have young bodies are not big enough to fill that space. They can do an indoor space, but not that big outdoor theatre. We're getting the idea that children were on the stage comes from the late 19th century. There was there is only one source for that, and it comes from the late 19th century, which is like, well, that's a bit garbage. That's not proper history. That's just, you made that up. Dress historians complain about a lot of that too, that a lot of the things that are written, the older books about dress history, are more or less made up, that come from that late 19th century period. There is a lot of bad history from that period. But one little rabbit hole I went down was the idea of co-authoring, which I found in one of the Cambridge Companion books. And I was like, okay, I want to know more about co-authoring. And everything to do with co-authoring went back to one book, which is this book, Shakespeare, co-authored by Brian Vickers. So this is like the OG book on co-authoring, which is a really fascinating thing and really undermines the whole single idea of an author that became more of a thing in the 18th century, but was not a thing Shakespeare recognised. Shakespeare is believed to have co-authored several of his plays, a couple at the beginning of his career, Henry VI Part 1, which is believed to have about 5 authors, one of whom is including Marlowe. And the more you get used to Shakespeare, the more you can start to go, oh, that bit's Shakespeare, that bit isn't. That doesn't sound a thing like Shakespeare. Henry VI Part 1, it had about 5 authors because they would farm them out. The plays themselves were the most expensive things for the theatres. And holding on to authors who could write good plays was something you did. Shakespeare was primarily an actor-sharer who wrote plays. He didn't, the 36 plays that we have of Shakespeare's would not have filled out enough of the repertoire for the Globe Theatre. They went through so many plays. they just churn through them like nothing else. So in order to, you know, keep getting plays, you'd farm them out to lots of different people. You might have a primary author who'd then farm them out to, you know, up-and-coming writers, which is what Shakespeare was at the beginning of his career, an up-and-coming writer. He'd written a couple of plays, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Taming of the Shrew, got people to notice him, wrote Henry VI. Actually, no, he'd written the what we now call Henry VI Part 2 and Part 3 that had different names, and they're published under different names in quartos in his lifetime, very early on. And then he did, and so on the back of about 4 plays, he gets this invited into a big one, something big with a bunch of already established playwrights like Nash. I think it's Nash is in that, or it might be, but definitely Marlowe. I'd have to have a look and see who the other playwrights are. I'll stick them up here. But he's invited in with there. After that, the play goes through, and then he has his sonnets, which actually really did make him a big name, and then he appears to have joined the Globe. So co-writing is a real thing. The other one at the beginning of his career that he co-wrote was Titus Andronicus. And when you read when you look at Titus Andronicus, you can tell the first act is written by Peele. And then you can tell the next bit's written by Shakespeare, because although it's not a Shakespeare sort of story, the language changes. Peele is, compared to Shakespeare's writing, is very... It has a different style, a different flow, and the way Shakespeare will take things and the direction he'll take, because co-writing involved a really strong plotting. It has to do this, but you can say whatever you want in between to get it to that. So long as you hit those spots, so long as it matches up with the next act that somebody else might be writing, you're all good. So generally, the more experienced playwright would take the front end of the play, and the less experienced playwright would take the back end of the play. And that's what Shakespeare did towards the end of his life with several other playwrights, with the co-written plays from the end, which include Pericles and a couple of the, I think, Timon of Athens, a couple of the ones that nobody really worries about. Henry VIII is a co-written play, and so is Two Noble Kinsmen. And I saw Two Noble Kinsmen, and it starts out really good, and then the other playwright comes along, and it sort of drops off a cliff a bit. Shakespeare would never have had Morris dancing. I'm just saying, he would. He never had it before. So you can... It's a really fascinating area of study to look at that. So I played with that. There's actually a whole lesson in the book about having the children co-write a play. So it's a really fascinating part of Elizabethan theatre, and also helps explain why they did not see that sort of copyright, because it was the theatre companies that owned the copyright, not the author. The theatre companies bought the plays. They didn't belong to the author. So is a really fascinating look at how plays could be written and how they often were written. So that one's a really great one. Finally, I had a look at, well, not actually finally, these are second to last. James Shapiro's 1599 and The Year of Lear, Shakespeare in 1606. Really fascinating books, brilliantly researched. These are the James Shapiro books. I've got a third one here too. The James Shapiro books are the most easily accessible. All the others that I have here are all deeply academic textbooks. These are ones that you really can just pick up and read as a general reader. They are wonderfully accessible, hugely researched, really fascinating. Just looking at Shakespeare via a single year in his life. And what James Shapiro does prove is it's remarkable how much there actually is historical record of Shakespeare, once you stop looking for the holy grail of like Shakespeare's diary, which wouldn't exist because people didn't think in those terms. That's what I mean about the 18th century. Got into problems because they started thinking about Shakespeare in Shakespearean, non-Shakespearean terms. People didn't keep diaries in the same way. They were expecting Shakespeare to be like an 18th century gentleman. He was an Elizabethan playwright. This is a very different world. It's a world 200 years, 150 years, 200 years before them. Do we expect people 200 years earlier to have been the same? No. But they kind of did, and that warped our view. This is starting to bring that view, pulling it back to what do we actually have? Rather than dreaming up, looking for impossibilities, we look for what we have. And talking about impossibilities, this one, James Shapiro's contested will, who wrote Shakespeare, looking at the whole idea of why people question Shakespeare writing Shakespeare, what they possibly could gain out of it, who they were putting up in its place, and why ultimately James Shapiro and I think if you read this, because it's very compelling, is like, aside from the fact that apart from snobbishness, why are you doing this? Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Why this was not something that happened. Part of I think why people, because the Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare didn't really start until about the 18th century, late 18th century, and I think part of it is because people were not watching him, they were reading him. Now these texts are a completely different experience to read than to watch. I don't like reading them. They are dense, they are difficult. The fact that Anthony Sher from last week's video, Sir Anthony Sher, classical actor, finds reading the plays difficult is, if you find reading them difficult, no shame. They are hard to read. However, listening to them, watching them in performance, you don't go through them line by line. But what happened is people were going through things line by line, and the question of how someone is reading something is really interesting. And I think that is a question that comes up with some of these people who decided, oh no, Shakespeare couldn't have written this because of this, that, and the other, because they had spent so much time reading it in a very particular manner, so that things that are on stage, throwaway lines that you don't even notice, they were attaching huge attention to. I think partly led to this. Also a certain level of snobbishness, a certain level of, oh no, ordinary man couldn't possibly have written this, does creep in. It also doesn't, when the idea of a nobleman doing this over and then giving it to someone, who in their right mind would put their name to something they didn't write? People got tortured. People could be arrested. People could die. This wasn't, you said the wrong thing, you could get in big, big trouble. The Chamberlain's men played Richard II for Essex, and they got hauled in because hauled into the court. They're like, what on earth are you doing? We were just commissioned to play Richard II, because it was an overtly political act on the part of Essex. He was a pretender to the throne. So it was, you didn't put your name to stuff you didn't write. It was dangerous. And when you start looking at something like the co-authoring and realizing, oh, that front piece of Titus, didn't write that. Someone else wrote that. The idea starts to fall apart, and especially since none of the people who are mentioned as pretenders actually lived in the right time scale. Well, so Fletcher and Watts and the others just picked up half-done plays and finished them, did they? It becomes quite a silly concept, and that's what James Shapiro looks at. Really fascinating book. Again, like the other Shapiros, really easy to engage with. And finally, this one, which is David Crystal and Ben Crystal's Shakespeare's Words, a Glossary and Language Companion. You want to do anything with Shakespeare, you need one of these. This is a really, really good one. It's completely available. This is the one Anthony Sher talks about using. So it's got a recommendation from Kenneth Branagh as well. So it's a really, really good glossary. It's got everything in it. It's got these sections where, I'll see if I can find one. They're in darker. Here we go. So that one's hither, thither, and whither. So verbs. It's got one with like clothing items. So it's got the words, plus it's also got these interesting things. That one's on money, because these are all things that can be a bit of a bar to understanding the plays. There is a glossary in the back of my book, but it's only for the Year 8 unit. For the Year 10 unit, which is a full study of plays, this is the book I recommend that you get. I tried to put everything that I could possibly put into the book so that you didn't have to buy additional resources, but this is one resource that it's just not possible to replicate a glossary this comprehensive. So the two things that I would recommend are a glossary and a good copy of the plays, and not a film copy, because none of these. I do have the Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare and Film. I did not use it because I use stage productions. I use recordings of stage productions for the plays themselves, because you want as full a text as possible. And I have found over the years that film grammar and the grammar of the actual text, the stage grammar of the text, jar against each other. And I can't use film versions for what Her Infernal Majesty does, because people move things and cut things, and then I get confused and I can't do the full text properly. So I never use films. I like some of the films. I really like the Kenneth Branagh Hamlet, but I do find film grammar does distract from the stage grammar and can shift your focus a little too much, which is why I don't recommend using those with the book for the students. You want to keep them, you want to keep it as easy to access as possible, and a good stage production is going to help a lot better than even the best film because of that clashing in grammars. So anyway, that's that. Those are all the books that I was having a look at when I wrote my book. Again, it's available. So I would, if you are a teacher, if you know an English teacher out there, let them know the book's out. It's there to help, and I hope it does help other people as much. I had great fun writing it. I'm really relieved that 2 years of writing is over though, but I really enjoyed writing it. I really enjoyed doing all the research for it, and I hope that maybe if you're interested in deep diving into Shakespeare, I might have given you some interesting ideas of places to look. Next week, Her Infernal Majesty will be along for the remaining 3 weeks of the month, and she will be doing the Henry VI plays. So I will see you again, back in my proper costume, with some books from Adventures in Australian Literature. So until then, I'll see you later. Bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.